After studying the Great Migration and the Harlem Renaissance, we did it pretty sketchily, but we need to take a real look at poetry of the Harlem Renaissance. Here we have our classic photo of Harlem Renaissance poets. We are going to ask you to think of poems as primary sources when you do the poetry analysis assignment. We're asking you to analyze a poem by County Cullen, Claude McKay, or Langston Hughes using the Poetry Analysis Guide. We're also thinking that it would be fine if you wanted to do a poem by Alter Brodie, who was a Jewish American poet. That could be a very cool way to do a comparison of poets who were contemporaries of one another. We're going to ask you to post that analysis. Then we're going to ask you to do a peer review using the rubric and post that review. On the discussion board, we're also going to ask you to answer this particular question. Why should poetry be considered a primary source? Many kids are familiar with the Harlem Renaissance poets. They're taught oftentimes in American literature classes. Poems that we are going to ask you to analyze would come from County Cullen, whose most famous poem is Yet I Do Marvel, which was published first in 1925. Yet I do marvel at this curious thing, to make a poet black and bid him sing. Students also like the poetry of Claude McKay, who came to us from Jamaica, part of that Caribbean migration. Claude McKay's America, which was first published in 1921. Although she feeds me bread of bitterness and sinks into my throat her tiger's tooth. America by Claude McKay. Langston Hughes is one of the students' most favorite poets because he seems to resonate today very well. And his poetry often reflected the music of the times. You can almost hear the blues, the jazz. He's the only one of the Harlem Renaissance poets who loved the music at the time. One of his poets, I Too, harkens back to Walt Whitman. But this poem is published in 1926. I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They sent me to eat in the kitchen. When company comes, but I laugh, and I eat well and grow strong. To help you with poetry analysis, we've developed a guide, which is pretty simple and should even encourage the most skeptical teacher and student that, yes, you can do poetry. The Poetry Analysis Guide should always be read first. Again, we want you to make sure you know what you're looking for in the poem so that you are guided in your reading. I selected Langston Hughes' I Too. It's one of my favorite poems, and it was one that really resonated with my student. So what we'd like you to do is, again, to establish, consider the source. Who is this poet? Before you read the poem, read the poet's biography. You can do research. Most of the times you'll find his biography in American Lit books. As you read the poem, have the kids engage in active reading. Have them underline words and phrases that relate to historical facts. Obviously, then, this poem has to be taught in historical context. See if they can figure out how the poem is relating to the history of that time. Circle words or phrases that stir up emotions, and then have them place question marks next to ideas that they don't recognize or even you don't recognize that need to be researched. Mark up the reading. It helps kids direct their reading. After you read the poem, now answer the following questions. What historical background does a reader need to better understand this poem? This is where all this history we've been talking about, have kids write it down so they understand that this poem was written with all of these events bearing down on the poet. And he is desperately trying to change the situation. This is an action of social change. Make sure they know historical context. Then, how does the poem relate to migration? Both refer to the poem and historical context. Look at the words that you've circled or your students have circled that stir up emotions. What emotions do these words make you feel? Are those emotions negative or positive? Both? You're going to find in this poem that there are words that are both negative and positive. And then think about your responses to both 2 and 3, and think about how the poet is persuading you to think about migration and migrants. Write your response in a sentence. And then based on your analysis, we're asking you to put in your own words what the poet's message is. And then lastly, what did you learn by analyzing this poem? Did the poem do what the poet wanted to do? Remember, writers, authors, write in order to do something. What did the poem do? What did you learn? We have a rubric for this analysis as well. Again, we are asking you to evaluate the quality of the information on the poem, the poet, and the historical context. We're asking you to make sure that you or the person you're reviewing has related the poem to historical context with relevant evidence, that they've explained emotion through the word choice of the poet, that they've established the poet's perspective by using evidence from the poem as well as historical evidence, and that they can thoughtfully express what was learned in the poem. We really hope that this guide will help you use poetry more often in your classroom. Poetry, kids love it. It's usually short, to the point, and incredibly important when teaching students word choice and how a person can have a voice on particularly social issues that concern them. Use poetry. It works with students.